All right, well, hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. It looks like it's about 2:30, so we'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Michael Weisenburg. I'm the Reference and Instruction Librarian for the Irvin Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, and this afternoon we're going to be talking about engaging your patrons through special collections. I just want to go over a few major takeaway points, a general outline for things I'll be talking about in this presentation. One second here, it's obscuring my slides, so I can't quite see my own screen. My apologies. There we go. All right. So I'm going to be talking about outreach, programming, practical tips, and integrating special collections. Outreach generally to faculty, students, and the general public. Programming such as classes, lectures, and reading room assignments. I'll also go over some practical tips on handling and teaching with rare materials, how to set direct and measurable goals for assignments, and consider a little bit things regarding retention and recursive pedagogy. And there'll be some talk about integrating rare books in coursework and rare books and the library. These are things to keep in mind as we go through the presentation. I'll be building on these themes to varying degrees, with most of my focus being on programming and practical tips. Though do bear in mind that these topics overlap, and I'll be shuttling back and forth a bit with some intentional repetition. So I want to start by contextualizing this a little bit with some quotes from the scholarly literature on teaching with special collections. Teaching with rare books requires that users overcome commonly held misconceptions about what special collections libraries are, that rare books or special collections departments are rarely viewed as a pedagogical resource stems in part from the widespread assumption that texts exist wholly independently of the physical books or manuscripts which they appear. And there's this sort of general wider cultural misapprehension about special collections, which often remains in a limited sense among those who have not had occasion to interact with our faculty, staff, or materials. These are a lot of special collections engagement is about dispelling these myths and preconceived notions regarding libraries and librarians. Granted, some of these popular held beliefs about rare books and archives come from the history of the discipline and have since been reified by popular culture. Just think of any representation of a librarian or a rare books librarian from novels, movies, and TV, and you'll generally imagine a picture of some old Senex figure, maybe wearing tweed, who's a bit stuffy and condescending, or perhaps who is obsessed with the arcane and the mystical. Our job is largely to dispel these stereotypes, as fun and charming as they may be. And the easiest way to do that is by being able to let students touch artifacts and think about who used them and how, and by contemplating the technologies, ideas, and assumptions of a given time. This allows history to be humanized for students. And as Matthew Kirchenbaum has pointed out, knowing how textual things work better teaches students to see the text as a social artifact. And so the first step for dispelling these myths is to do outreach. And so getting faculty and community leaders' attention is really central to this type of work. People need to know that you exist. That's sort of the first step. A lot of these people who you're going to want to reach might not know that there is a rare books department in your library. And you have to let them know who you are, what you have in your collections, and what you have to offer them regarding education and programming. These people might not be looking at the catalog. They're probably not coming to you with research questions. And so you have to go out into the world and invite them. And once you have them in your space, you sort of have to wow them and get them to appreciate what you have. This can be done by a couple of different means. Tours or behind the scenes peeks are often a good way to do this. This gives people a sense of privilege and awe that they'll take away from the meeting and then share with their friends. You want to be able to let the books and the items do most of the heavy lifting in these initial informal gatherings. Don't necessarily worry about having people come away with anything other than a sense of positive feeling and response to their experience. This is really just a low stakes get to know us type of approach, getting administrators, faculty members or community members talking about your department in other contexts so that other people will then come and find you is usually the main goal of this type of work. Some easy low threshold outreach tips include a couple of different strategies. Assuming that you might be working at a college or university, the best thing to do is to survey course bulletins, syllabuses, and public lectures. Look for professors who are teaching in subject areas that relate to your collections, and keep an eye out for public talks that relate to your holdings. Cold calls and emails often work quite well. Have a standard form letter that highlights why a visit to your collections will be enriching experience. And every time you hear about a new faculty member or a new course being offered, whether it's just the first time you're hearing about this person, or maybe it's a wholly new faculty member at the university or a new course that's being offered, it's a really quick and easy way to just get in touch with someone and let them know that you exist and encourage them to get back in touch and begin the process of working towards integrating your collections into their coursework. A lot of people will probably ignore you, and that's fine, but some people will be very excited and energetic about the prospect of getting rare books into the hands of their students, and you can sort of go from there. Networking and word of mouth often encourage visitors to post on social media and tell their colleagues about their experiences with bringing their students to the collections or doing their own research. Handing out business cards when you go to public events, and encouraging people to share things about the department through their media handles is a really easy way to get a lot of information and a lot of word of mouth without a whole lot of work. Partnering with other cultural institutions and events is a very powerful way to get rare books, the idea of rare books and special collections, out into the greater community. We should be asking ourselves what type of integrated programming and cross-promotion we can do for each other. So a couple of concrete examples about this. At the Irvin department, we've had a great deal of success working with people such as the State Library, the State Museum, the Columbia Museum of Art, and Stormwater Studios, sort of getting out into the general public, getting into venues we normally wouldn't be found in, and working with them, whether it's sharing materials, showcasing our materials in their exhibits, having them bring their materials into our exhibits, or giving public talks in arenas in which we might not normally be seen, heightens our awareness, heightens the general public's awareness of our resources and our presence in the community. And finally, reaching out to students and cultural organizations. It's often good to sort of take a step back every once in a while and consider whether or not there are populations of users who we might be missing or not attracting, and consider how we might reach them. And then just going out and contacting them and asking them if they'd like a tour or a visit, or asking them what kind of services they'd like to see from us. If they're not coming to us to begin with, it might simply be because they don't know that we exist, or then again, it could be because they don't feel like they're wanted or that they belong, and we want to try and break down those barriers. So the rest of this is mostly going to be giving specific examples of what has worked for us, and looking at different levels of engagement with groups of students and community members, starting from the large and then working our way down to the small in terms of large groups, medium-sized groups, and smaller groups, and then broader examples funneling down to very specific examples in classroom activities. And while much of the rest of this is going to be largely anecdotal based on my own experience, I hope that I can contextualize this in a way that viewers and members of this webinar will find affectatious and adaptable to their own unique circumstances. So exhibits and tours, along with HIGHPOINT lectures, are better suited for larger groups and younger students. And I think it's really important to consider large groups and younger students and how we can interact with them in an exhibit environment. Outreach to K through 12 schools is an opportunity for service to the greater community. We might consider whether faculty might be teaching a course that relates to current and future exhibitions, and reaching out to them and getting them to bring their students in during classroom time for a general tour. These are both easy ways to reach a broad audience and establish future connections. And I'll just give a few brief examples as to how this has worked for us in the past. What you're seeing here is an image of Hammond High School students touring a Shakespeare exhibit that we had in the Irvin department in 2016. was an extremely large group of students. I think Hammond brought something like 300 students through the libraries in one day. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I believe it was about that much. And the goal of this was really just to get students exposed to the historical material within a controlled environment, give them a few key takeaway points so that they understood the history of the topic and that they could leave having learned something that was relevant to their course of work. Often we'll have high school students, AP English schools coming in about once a year or once a semester to hear lectures about things that they're reading in class, such as Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. With reference to university classes, a Weird Science exhibition was an opportunity for us to reach out to professors in the history of science and the history of culture to get them to bring these large gen ed lecture classes of about 150 students to self-tour the exhibit and for extra credit and work on just really simple low impact assignments, get them in the building, get them seeing materials and thinking about things in a historical context, and then getting some sort of credit. But what that yielded to us as a department was that several of these students came back later in the semester and asked to do reading room research for their term papers. So while the broad strokes of it might only be that we're getting a lot of students doing sort of minimal or superficial work, the students for whom this type of research really speaks to will come back, will seek us out after having had this initial positive experience, and will want to do research in the reading room, will want to start to do term papers and senior theses using rare and special materials. A couple of other more recent examples have been the Justice for All exhibit, which included many university libraries departments across several different collections and was spearheaded by Bobby Donaldson with the Civil Rights Center. And this not only reached out to undergraduate and high school classes, but also to local community groups and local churches. So bringing in the broader community into the libraries, seeing this type of material, and being inspired by the fact that there was a space within the community that was housing and protecting these materials so that they could have some type of access and meaningful relationship to it. And most recently, the comic book exhibit, which not only brought in a lot of younger people, but also brought in considerably more media attention than perhaps any of our other exhibits to date. And if you happen to be able to make relationships with people who have podcasts or who have webinars or webcasts or who are working for the local news and TV stations, that's a really good way to get the general community reminded periodically when there's a major cultural event that we exist and we have resources that they might want to consider. So since we already have this exhibit up and we've been building these things and planning them for weeks and sometimes months, it's worth putting in a little bit of extra effort to get a greater return for the labor in producing the exhibit. And so even just having people walk through the exhibit is often a meaningful and worthwhile experience. In terms of classroom use, students often benefit from even just having one-to-one lectures that are related to their classroom course of study. So as Jonathan Suseda has pointed out, undergraduate research offers academic librarians and archivists an additional motivation to engage students with special collections. Curriculum design, course instruction, and mentoring by librarians and archivists can benefit not only students, but also the institution as well. And a couple of suggestions I would give is that if you have a one-off visit to a rare books room or archive, then it's best to plan with the instructor and try to locate a few items that illustrate a salient point. However, if the assignment is part of a larger project, then it helps to have it be iterative, modular, and progressive. So what do I mean by that? Ideally, your assignment for the students will be iterative insofar as it will repeat what they've already learned in class. It'll be modular in that it will stand alone and can be easily plugged into their coursework. And it will be progressive insofar as it adds something new to their knowledge base and thereby gives them a sense of accomplishment. This will help build confidence in the students when they're working with the material, and it will give them a reason for actually trying to relate these historical items to the larger theoretical topics that they've been discussing in class. So using rare materials, the why and the how. It's good to have clear goals and specific takeaways for why rare and archival materials are being used and how to work with them. Students are often unused to reading early modern type, handwritten letters, or navigating an early newspaper. And while immersion is great, even a little can go a long way when it comes to exposing students to rare and archival evidence. As much as we might want the experience to be about exploration, it really needs to be about explanation. We're here to model the type of work that's done with these objects and to teach them the questions that they should be asking when they're looking at these primary sources. So modeling how to read these items and introducing and explaining the basic vocabulary of working with historical material and contextualizing both how historical actors would have interfaced with the medium, as well as how modern scholars develop theories and narratives out of a selected array of data. So it's often beneficial to know the instructor's own research or own stakes in teaching this course a little bit, because it makes it further intimate for the students, but also helps them have some type of material thing to latch onto as to why they're looking at these objects in the first place. This is the type of research the professor does. This is the type of scholarship that the person who wrote the book they've been assigned is involved in order to develop that narrative history. So when first exposing special collections research, it helps to begin the session with a brief explanation of the department and how and why it differs from a circulating collection. Next, it's good to give them a brief roadmap or summary of what you will cover. This gives them time to settle in, and it anchors the new experience in the familiarity of their course of study. Finally, it's good to explain that this is a type of work that their professors and other academics do in their own research, and this elevates students to the level of peer, and it gives them a little bit more confidence. When considering smaller groups, it's often good to try and run it like a graduate seminar. So I'm going to shuttle back and forth here a little bit to try and illustrate this point. For a group that's medium sized, maybe not so large that you have to be bound by an exhibit and a tour, but it's not so small that you feel comfortable giving students free reign of handling materials, it will generally be largely lecture based. It's best to have the instructor at the front of the room with the material sort of laid out in the order it will be presented, and just relying on the overhead historical explanation and a lot of Q&A to help students feel like they're engaging with the material. But if you have a smaller class of, say, about 15 or fewer students, it's good to let them sort of stretch their skills a bit and try and actually interact with the material a bit more one-on-one. This is generally for upper division undergraduate courses or graduate seminars, and there's usually less lecture and more activities in these types of environments. So with this type of classroom, I'll generally have a brief introduction and an overview of how to handle the materials, with a few general examples to model how to work with them and what to look for, especially with specific examples. More time is allotted to students working independently or in pairs to discover and then reconvene at the end so that they can share what they've learned with their peers as well as with the instructor. So here we have one example of what this might look like. It's a survey of medieval manuscripts representing different genres and styles. And this just allows students in-depth practice with working with rare material. Everything is laid out in a way that's visually organized. Things are controlled. They're explained how to handle the material and what to do with it. And they're given the tools to examine them. And of course, myself, the instructor, the rare books librarian, and the faculty member or instructor for the class are able to sort of float through the crowd or the group of students and answer questions as they come up and guide them in their engagement with the material. In addition to organizing it like a seminar, it helps that if you can lay out the material so that it tells a story. This is going to, again, make things a bit more legible and concrete for students. Here we have historical texts, first editions, and facsimiles laid out to explain the development of the English literary canon, but this can be done with really any subject you have a relatively strong collecting focus in. It works just as well for the history of science, the development of art, or the spread of religions across time. So laying things out so that students can work around the table without necessarily having to worry about the way they're handling the material. Just at a quick glance, they can learn about the history of their subject matter and their topic from the original primary source materials. Extensive holdings, a deep dive into one author or idea helps make that person and their work real. So massive surveys of a topic can be great, and they make the topic seem more impressive and get students excited about coming back to do more research, but we have to be careful not to overwhelm them. This is sort of a sledgehammer approach to working with rare material. If you happen to be very strong in one particular item or subject matter, it's very impressive, but then again, the instructor has to be there to help filter and focus all of this data that students are going to be exposed to. So often pull more than I can talk about, but organize the cart so that the first few items I pull are essential to their course readings or to the goals that their professor wants them to take away from the meeting, but then the rest is there to pick and choose from depending on the student's questions. So it allows the instructor greater latitude and flexibility in dealing with questions or fielding topics as they come up, being able to sort of pull from the cart and then show students and explain and contextualize what they're learning in class based on the original source material. Going in the opposite direction, even a small collection can offer a meaningful experience and expand the student's understanding of their topic. You might have an instructor come to you and say, I'm teaching X, I'm teaching the history of television and media, and your special collections might not necessarily be strong in modern technology or visual technology, but there's probably something in there that you can bring together to sort of help students see what the history of their topic was. This happened to me once, and while we have very good film and media and television holdings, I really wanted to focus students' attention on the very early years of television because I figured it would probably be more foreign to them and a bit more interesting and exotic. So just looking at a few of the earliest textbooks and instruction manuals on how to use a television from its earliest inception was a way to sort of defamiliarize them and recontextualize their course topic for them. This could also work in an archive or manuscript scenario in which you have different letters going back and forth between people surrounding a particular topic, and it sort of shows in real time the way an idea or an event played out. And it's a good way to model how using the archival record is something that faculty and historians will do to reproduce what must have happened and draw reasonable inferences and conclusions from that. So a little bit more on the why and the how. Many students will initially be afraid to touch an old book, while a few will be too cavalier or rough. So it's important to explain to students how to handle material and model proper technique. This is important to do pretty much right after your introduction to what rare books are. Take a few minutes to explain how to handle the material, what to do with it, how to respect it, but also not to be so afraid that they don't want to touch it at all. Another thing that I generally like to do is get the students to think about the relationship between how they first learned about this topic to looking at the historical item itself. So something as simple as asking students to compare a rare book with the modern textbook or anthology they first engage with the source can be very revelatory for them. Students are often surprised and excited to see a manuscript or a first edition of a work that they initially experienced in a textbook or some sort of digital content management system such as Blackboard. And much like the archives and libraries from which they are mined, the great anthologies of the 20th century and the content management systems of the 21st century, while they're very convenient, work to include how individual titles and documents originally circulated and were read. So in this sense, our job is to recontextualize the historical means of production and dissemination of an idea or a work. The best way to do this is to have a small assignment and some type of anchor text or document that relates to the classroom readings. Ideally, you have the thing that they had just read the day before class or for that day's class. If not, you have something that's very close or analogous to that topic or to that specific edition or item. And doing this, I think it's also fine to just make it personal and leverage the inherent intimacy of the material. It's perfectly acceptable to let students be impressed by the age of the objects and the fact that these bits of paper have survived the wreckage of time. Not every student needs to leave your class session feeling like they have their research topic. I think it's perfectly acceptable for students to come away from this experience having been wowed or surprised by or just charmed by the fact that this is the first edition, or this is an early edition, or this is a variant that they didn't really talk about in class, and what might this version have done for its readers versus another version. And some, of course, will come back and want to work with the materials on their own. Now, with that in mind, it's also worth talking about reading room assignments and managing expectations for how students are going to operate in the reading room and what faculty and instructors want students to learn when they come back on their own, separate from the rest of the class. I suggest that assignments should be specific, measurable, and time-bound. Put another way, assignments should teach a specific skill that students will be able to engage with and be something that students can accomplish within a reasonable amount of time. 1 or 2 weeks at most. You don't want them coming to your class session, leaving for a month or two, and then coming back and having to relearn the experience of how to work with the material. I find that instructors often want students to go to the library and explore and discover. I suggest discouraging such approaches. It's a romantic ideal that often leaves students confused, discouraged, and afraid of failure, which is counterproductive to the pedagogical mission we have. Rather, I suggest working closely with instructors to develop an assignment that relates to the coursework and teaches 1 or 2 topics or a skill that students can build on later if they so choose, if they want to go in that direction with their research papers. Comparing editions is a very low stakes one. Looking at advertisements or looking at the materiality of the work in which they're studying. And it helps to develop a worksheet that will lead towards a short response paper. So give students a handful of tasks and questions they have to fulfill when they come back to the reading room, and then that will be the material out of which they'll produce some sort of short piece of writing that they can submit to the instructor, showing that they've engaged with this material history on some higher level than just merely being receptacles of our knowledge. So I want to give you a couple examples, and I'm going to go through these a little bit quick, of just some practical things that I found that work relatively well and are pretty quick and easy to do no matter what you happen to have in your collections. One of my favorite things to do is to close read title pages and frontispieces. So even looking at one element of a book, such as a title page, can teach students about book history and reader responses and expectations over time. It's a really easy thing to do in class. If it's a medium-sized class and you're not necessarily able or comfortable letting students handle the material, you can put a series of title pages in front of them without having to worry about whether they've necessarily read this specific edition or this specific book. It's a whole world unto itself, and we as a group, with the instructor leading, can unpack the symbolism that's going on in these pages, talk about the techniques of how the woodcut or the engraving was made, why this particular idea, whether it's something like Chaucer and the birth of the English literary canon and the idea of the invention of authorship and the genealogy of literary texts, or something like Leviathan and these larger symbolic things that are going on in the frontispiece that represents the themes of the work and the idea of this notion of the monarch who is going to be the head of the body of the people, the body politic. Or it can be much simpler than that. Looking at an early English translation of Don Quixote, or really any early work, and just paying attention to the typography and how it's a little bit strange and different than what we're used to seeing when we look at title pages. Looking at the symbolism of the woodcuts without necessarily worrying exactly how they relate to the story. They might be just incidental to the publisher or the place of publication. In this case, London, England, having the English rose and the harp and that sort of thing going on in these. Or one of my favorites, the newses, right? Talking about something that they think they know and showing them the origins of it. This idea of the news, of people covering current events, of the invention of the newspaper and the magazine in the 16th and 17th centuries, and just close reading the words that happen on the title page and explaining to students that these were new ideas and new mediums meeting the needs of a new body of people who were literally called the people, and this idea of privilege and who has the right to print, and how it sort of contradicts our modern ideas of a free press, and it begins to show them the origins of these types of things. A lot can be done with just one page of text. And to expand upon this a little bit, I want to talk about early and Latin title pages. They require a little bit more work, but they teach a great deal about the book. And I want to encourage people to work with these types of things because it doesn't necessarily matter if the students read Latin. I want to emphasize that. This is an idea I got from Ali Alvis, who is the reference librarian at the Smithsonian, and she suggests that it helps students to have one book the whole workshop, and that way they can build a personal connection to it. So this is a sort of a broader approach to teaching book history and working with rare or special materials. Don't necessarily worry. This is sort of the opposite approach of like making sure it absolutely connects to the coursework at hand. Don't necessarily worry if the student is going to know this text or be able to read the text. What this assignment does is it teaches students how to look at a book. So we're not really dealing with content here. We're looking at structure, we're looking at themes and forms, we're looking at things like layout, the elements of the page, the elements of type, and the way the book is structured. Title pages, years of publication, how to figure out who the publisher is, what are the signatures, how to collate, what does the binding look like. So starting with the title page, the instructor can explain handling and how to look at an old book. Students can then work through their book slowly while the instructor goes around and insists. And then later, students can be invited to share what they found or learned about their book with the class. And since they're just working with one book, they have the time to meditate over it and gain confidence as they slowly page through the object. And if they find something neat, whether it's a piece of marginalia or something that's been laid in or a weird type device, they can then share that with the rest of the group and feel a sense of accomplishment and start to piece together how to see these things. Another route to go is to engage students in old school descriptive bibliography. Having students look at multiple editions of a book is a good way to talk about textual transmission and cultural trends. And this can be done with popular modern works as well as rare or old material. So you don't necessarily have to have a special collections that's filled with lots of rare, old, or fragile books. This could be done with modern books. This could be done with a circulating collection, even if it was properly curated. And the differences in layout, typeface, paper stock, bindings, dust jackets, and cover illustrations show how audiences' expectations and cultural values may have changed over time. So here's an example of some students from Columbia College who were taking a class on literary theory and textual criticism. And I just had them look at Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt, different states of the same edition of a very modern book with these apparatuses that were developed in the early 20th century to compare different editions of text to one another. And it's, again, it's very engaging. Students get a kick out of using this antiquated technology to sort of see the books differently. Another way of comparing editions, media formats, and appropriations works if you have an extremely popular author such as Milton, Fitzgerald, or in this case, Emily Dickinson. Here we have editions of Emily Dickinson's poetry compared to a 21st century remediation. And this helps students think critically about what defines authorship and the structure of a book. So is a deck of cards of just Emily Dickinson's poems, or just really lines from her poems, the same as the first edition of her poems, which was famously heavily edited and bolderized posthumously after her death? Who really is Emily Dickinson, and how do we define what her poems are? And if you just take a deck of cards and shuffle them and then lay them out haiku style or divination style, who is the author of that new poem? Is it Dickinson? Is it the student? Is it both of them? This gets them engaging and questioning the very idea of textuality and the very nature of what makes up a book to begin with. It's also fun and beneficial to think about what might be hiding just in the broader world. So this is a circulating stack search. This is David Shea, my colleague, the cataloger in the Irvin department, working with undergraduate students in the Thomas Cooper Library looking for marginalia. So circulating stacks also have old books or unique items. And you know, we can determine what is or is not a rare book or a special book is a pretty broad metric for that. And even in circulating stacks, you might find things that are at least old or unique from an undergraduate's perspective and might have interesting elements and data in them that can be mined for research purposes or just for fun. So we took students into the Cooper stacks in search of 18th and 19th century books with historic marginalia. Students had a great time and learned that history can be anywhere, not just necessarily in special collections, and I would even argue not just necessarily in the library. Maybe this will get students going to physical brick and mortar bookstores again. Speaking of marginalia and the history of readers, marginalia of any kind, even modern, helps students feel more connected to books and the people who read them in the past. So the history of reading situates the students in conversation with historical strangers. These stories about these books also help make this copy unique, and it allows the students to see that every book that they could possibly encounter might have something to teach them or might have something to reveal or show them. So these are just some examples of historical marginalia. Sometimes they're writing, sometimes you have doodles, but you might also have something really profound like the copy of Ash Wednesday that T.S. Eliot inscribed and gave to F. Scott Fitzgerald, right? There's a barter economy, there's a gift economy, there's a dilatory student, right, with the doodlings in the old book of Virgil, right? All of these different things are things that students can latch onto and feel an intimacy with. Aside from marginalia, you might sometimes find laid objects within books, especially old books. It's not uncommon to find pressed flowers, clover, and leaves in books, even in circulating stacks. And these laid-in botanical specimens add another historical element and remind students that people do things with books other than read them. Aside from botanicals, it's common to find things that were used as bookmarks, such as scraps of cloth, photos, postcards, or even old letters, which adds another intimate dimension to the object. And reminding students that people do things with books other than reading them, I think, is important. Some of my favorite things to show are old children's books in which children have scribbled and colored in the illustrations. An early example of Alice in Wonderland that we have in the collection has been colored in very talentedly by a child who couldn't believe that Wonderland would be black and white, right? The idea, we tell students not to write in books, and I'm not saying we should encourage students to write in our books, but showing them that people have written in books over the course of time helps make books more meaningful. Also, that people do things with books besides writing them, such as kissing them, in the case of medieval manuscripts, as objects of iconography and ritual behavior. So getting students to think about books as something other than a thing with words in it, but something that a human interacted with, I think is one of the most important things we can show them. Odds are, if you have a special collections in your department or associated with your libraries, there are various realia or other media objects and historical objects that you might have an opportunity to work with. And this can allow for an opportunity to talk about emergent media and their relationship to the past. So here we have a 19th century stereoscope next to a 20th century viewfinder. And if I wanted to, we could throw in a 21st century Oculus Rift into the mix and talk about the idea of using imagery and photos to sort of remediate an experience, a sort of virtual experience that people have been really spending centuries trying to develop and improve and perfect. And this can lead to a discussion about outdated technology. And it's my experience that outdated technology has a huge retro or nostalgia factor for today's students. Students are excited by things like typewriters, carbon paper, ditto and mimeograph machines, and letterpress type. And the tactile and interactive nature of working with objects helps students think about how rare and archival material was originally produced and disseminated. So I would encourage people to look for outdated tech in closets and storage rooms, or ask friends and colleagues if they have any older machines or items that they'd be willing to donate to a teaching collection. Specifically with typewriters, what's interesting about them is TypeScript exists somewhere between manuscript and printing. It's this weird sort of third space that can be sort of hard to define. And obviously from an archival standpoint, we would consider it something similar to the manuscript. It's not the published material, but what happens when we start looking at typewriters and the early advent of zines and xerography and dittos? All of a sudden, this becomes an object or a space of publication that is somehow different from the traditional standard mainstream modes in which people would publish their work. And it gives students another avenue to sort of study the history of textual transmission. Also thinking about antiquated or outdated technology, we might start to now begin thinking about digital books and antique digital books. It doesn't always occur to students that modern technologies such as computers or ebooks have a history, and showing them early forms of things that they're familiar with has an uncanny effect and gets them thinking critically about what they take for granted. Early computer manuals, punch cards, magnetic type, and other media helps them see how modern technology has developed and gives them a historical context for things like databases and digital books. Comparing manuscript and print books to other media formats helps students to think about books as a form of information technology, as an interface, and as a storage device, which they're not always used to doing. Furthermore, getting students to think about recent history and the place that recent history has within a special collections gets them thinking about the special collections of the future, and it gets them thinking about their own moment as a historical moment, and it gets them to ask questions about what should we be saving, what should we be archiving, and who gets to determine that? What are the politics of that? And really good conversations can come out of looking at things that really aren't necessarily that old. Building on that, we can also talk to them about how the history of books is the history of libraries, and get them thinking self-reflexively about the very space that they're in and why it's designed the way that it's designed. So teaching the history of our own field is another way to teach the history of books. Changes in information architecture, discovery and retrieval, and reference are often informed by user needs and advances in technology. So it's often fun to just show students ads from old library journals. And it's a good way to historicize how libraries are used and how bibliographic instruction has changed. Also, we might try relating to students on their own level, and this has certain dangers of its own. You end up looking like the old person who's trying to be hip with the kids, but it often yields interesting results. You might have modern material in your special collections that speaks to current popular culture and will help students feel comfortable working with rare material. And so I think we should feel comfortable showing things like these alongside the more obscure items we have in our collections. Juxtaposing something like the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual with the medieval bestiary helps that medieval bestiary be more legible to the student, and it gives them some sort of cultural purchase. Maybe they've seen Stranger Things, maybe they play Dungeons and Dragons, but they're using the 5th edition and they've never seen the 1st edition before. These could all be different reasons why they're exciting. Or working with Harry Potter and the history of alchemy, or the history of witchcraft, or even just the history of science might be another way of going about sort of engaging these time gaps and sort of making these historical items come to bear on the popular culture of the moment. And so I think it's worthwhile to talk to students on their level. Keep in mind that students have no cultural anchor for interpreting these objects, and the onus is on the instructor to model historical reading. It's good to set up a room so that it's comfortable and items are laid out with a narrative in mind. Few students are unaccustomed to writing lengthy documents entirely by hand, and even fewer are familiar with cursive handwriting, so we have to teach them how to read these things as well as how they themselves were produced. Additionally, early modern typefaces often confuse students, especially Gothic fonts and that long S that was popular up until the 19th century. And so we need to be prepared to explain the basics of book anatomy. It's good to remind students that the works they are assigned were produced in a particular time and place and for a specific audience that may have had a shared horizon of expectations that is far different from our own current historical moment. This is sometimes made all the harder given the essentially decontextualizing nature of special collections reading rooms. The form of the archive itself situates the item, and each gain legitimization through their rarity and ritualization, and the architecture of which generates specific coordinates of epistemology that necessarily influence how students interact with and learn from archived and rare material. Put another way, the manner in which archives are created and stored, the manner in which rare books are cataloged and displayed today, often obfuscates the quotidian nature of the artifacts. It's easy for students to forget that these books were just once daily objects. They were once new objects. And the reason why it's easy for them to forget that is they're coming to these special collections. It's a special space. It's something different than what they're used to. They had to carve out time from their day to go to somewhere that is other than their classroom to look at these things. And we have to overcome that's the logic of that space to get them to look at these things as if they were new or as if they were being used by a person in a historical period. So while libraries and modern archives are designed for discoverability, and while scholarly inquiry is designed with the intent of asking salient questions about the past, it is not always clear to students how it is that these disparate mounds of data, these musty old tomes and piles of paper, amount to the historical knowledge. There are fundamental epistemological gaps between evidence and narrative that are ontologically rooted in the very interfaces that students are accustomed to learning from, i.e. textbooks and content management systems. And if students are to make any sense of why special collections matter, then we must ultimately make clear to them how history is born of them. So I would encourage us all to develop a repertoire. I know it sounds anticlimactic, but I think this is the best way to make sure that students come away with something that's meaningful. Get to know your special collections and your high point items. Write up mini lectures and assignments for your most commonly taught courses and themes, and then try to commit the beats of them, the broad strokes, to memory. That way you're not necessarily relying on notes as much as relying on what your basic innate knowledge of these materials are from working with them so often. Identify books and items that can serve multiple classes. This will help you a lot and save you a lot of time. Keep shelf lists for items that you use the most with notes on how to adapt them for multiple circumstances. Are you talking to the public? Are you talking to a classroom? Are you talking to young people or old people? This will help influence the way you want people to experience the items. And it's important to maintain relationships with faculty and community stakeholders who regularly bring in classes and groups for visits, because they're going to be your best friends. They're going to be the people who are not only going to come back again themselves, but they're going to tell other people about you and get you more traffic and more meaningful use of your collections, because ultimately these collections don't mean anything unless the students are using them, if faculty are researching from them, and if the public is seeing them. So these are just some suggestions for further reading. Everything I've quoted comes from these next two slides. This is by no means a definitive list, and I will happily turn this into a Word doc and or PDF and give it to Amy so she can add this to the SCLA website, and we can disseminate it that way. Also, you can feel free to contact me if you want a copy of that list, and I'd be happy to share it with anyone who wants it. And last, I want to say thank you very much for joining us, and I think we have some time for questions and answers.
Hi, Michael. We sure do, and I sure hope everybody can hear me now, because I realized about halfway through that apparently my introduction went into the internet void. But be assured that Michael's great content more than made up for that missing introduction. So, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. Michael, I will be happy to read them out loud so that everybody can hear them before you address them.
Yeah.
Well, while we are waiting for questions, I want to thank you again, Michael, for how fantastic that was. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with all of us. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and turn back over to my screen while monitoring this. Just to point out that we do have some more webinars coming up. I really hope you're all able to join us for our next webinar on the law and legal research on April 9th at 2 p.m. This is a webinar by Terry Conroy from the USC School of Law, and it kicks off a 5-part special series on promoting legal research. We also want to hear from you. If you have any feedback or an idea from a webinar, please do let us know through the links. Checking the chat one more time. Still don't see any questions. So I guess we're going to go ahead and call it. If you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to Michael directly. And thank you all so much for your time, everyone. I hope you have a fantastic afternoon. And thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you.